Baptist Foundation of Alabama, it's very important to us that we employ money managers to help manage the assets that we are steward of, who employ Christian principles. And as we were searching for managers, particularly in the healthcare space, the Lord led us to Eventide, a great group of Christian men and women who dive into these investments much deeper than most companies we've engaged with before.
When you have this huge amount of data, one of the things that can happen is if you use a robotic approach or a mechanical approach, is you can actually throw out companies that you actually shouldn't throw out if you go and look carefully at it.
With the background they have in academics and in healthcare, the folks at Eventide take a good hard look at the investments to make sure we can invest in them. Not only taking out the things we don't want to be invested in, but also finding companies that are adding value to our society.
In particular, in the healthcare and biotech realm, we have found that there's a lot of flags that get tripped, but if you actually look carefully at what's going on there, you would find that in fact those companies are tremendously value generating and not at all involved in activities that are opposed to, for example, the Christian worldview. But to do that and to figure that out, you've got to actually meet the people, call them, talk to the staff, and figure out what are you actually doing. So we're excited to partner with the Baptist Foundation of Alabama. Both their worldview, their message of giving are right in our heart as well, and we're very privileged to be managing a portion of the endowment.
Welcome.
Thank you.
This is Robin John. He's the CEO of Eventide. We're not really going to talk about Eventide. We had Finney here last year to talk about Eventide. We're going to talk about investments and how they're working these days and how we should think as biblical thinkers, as with a biblical worldview. How do we get through this minefield? But first, let me ask you about yourself, how you got to Eventide. Give me a little bit of your background, etc.
Yeah, so I knew Finney Finney, the CIO of Eventide. Finney and I started Eventide together in 2008, and I've known Finney probably for 15 years before that. Finney was doing his MD, PhD at Harvard, and I was still in high school, and I met him through church. And his parents run the second largest Bible school in northern India, so my family knew his family and just became very connected. Later, we started a house church together. And then much later, I had lost my job and was praying about purpose and asking God whether I should go into ministry and what that looks like, and prayed for 6 months. And my mom recently called me and said, basically I was living in the basement of my parents' house, and there was a washing machine dryer section. I guess she came down to wash the dishes, to wash the clothes, and she saw me kneeling beside the washing machine and just praying. And so she just she reminds me once in a while just to keep whatever commitments I made to God. But prayed for 6 months, and ultimately that led to the founding of Eventide with Finney. The two of us started that in 2008.
A little about your family. Can you tell me about?
Yes, so I'm married. Same year we started Eventide, I became married. My wife and I, we have 3 kids. And I was born in India, in southern India, moved to the U.S. when I was 8, on my 8th birthday in 1988. So that was on September 28th. So about last week was my 30-year anniversary of coming into this country. I'm 38 now. And my grandparents were missionaries in India. I spent the first 8 years living with them. So privileged to have, I would say, a Christian heritage and just witness in my family.
Speaking of 2008 was a really bad year to start an investment firm, by the way, but just saying. Anyway, so let's talk about just the state of investments. If you could, I've heard you speak of this before, just why do capital markets exist? What was the purpose? I heard Blake say a minute ago that the holding period is really gone away for people that hold stocks for a very long time. So what's the purpose of capital markets? Why do we even have markets in the beginning? So talk about that for me.
So investing at its core, the purpose of investing is to provide capital to businesses, right? So investing is ownership. So we should be asking ourselves, what types of companies do we want to partner with and own? What's happened in the stock market, I think, is that this principle of ownership has gone away, right? Investing has been divorced of its true purpose, which is to provide capital to good businesses. So part of this has to do with just the way the stock market is structured, but also the way that mutual funds are structured, ETFs are structured. Ultimately, nobody really knows what they own anymore. People will tell me, Robin, I'm invested in the market. I'm like, what does that mean? Like, what are you invested in? Sometimes people know the names of the mutual funds that they're invested in through their 401ks or through their IRA plans. But oftentimes, most people don't even know that. They just know they have a 401k plan. And ultimately, they don't know whether they're invested in pornography, tobacco, whatever it might be. So really what's happened, I think, over the past 50 years or so is that in the public markets, most people don't know what they're invested in anymore.
So let's talk about the evolution of how that's worked itself out. I think probably 10 years ago, we started with socially responsible investing, and then we evolved into ESG investing and now BRI investing. So you can talk a little bit about what those terminologies mean, and then maybe what they mean to you and how we deal with those as investors.
Socially responsible investing is kind of the broader movement that's in this country. And as Ross mentioned, there's ESG, which stands for Environment, Social, Governance. And there's impact investing. BRI stands for Biblically Responsible Investing. Some call it faith-based investing or values-based investing. There are so many different terminologies out there. And ultimately, within each of those categories, there are so many definitions even within those categories, right? Within socially responsible investing, there are investors that really focus on the environment. There are other investors that really focus on things like diversity inside of company management. So within the broader space, there are so many focus areas. Within biblically responsible investing, the focus historically has been, I would say, more on pornography and abortion. And historically, it's also been focused on avoidance, right? Exclusionary screens. You know, what do we as Christians not want to be invested in? Much more recently, I think the conversation has become much more about purpose. The moral conversation has always been there. But I would make the argument that the moral conversation is maybe less inspiring, especially to the younger audiences. So lately, the conversations have transformed into more conversations about purpose and what investing as a Christian should be. So going back to even the Genesis account, you see God being a creator. When God creates something, he says it is good. And then when God creates humanity, he says it is very good, right? So, and then the Bible says God created man in his image, man and woman, right, in his image. Male and female, he created them. And so the only thing we know about God at this point in the creation account is that he is a creator, and then he creates us in his image. So we as humanity have this amazing calling to be creating and to be partnering with God in creating good things that are value creating, that are blessing others. So when we invest into companies, we're partnering with companies that are creating, right? Companies that are bringing about blessing or harm in the world. So as Christians, we have this great opportunity to partner with good companies that are creating good things.
So in the past, we've been able to sort through a list of securities to know which ones are not abiding by the principles that we lay out, whether it's abortion, pornography, alcohol, tobacco, gaming. We can see where revenues come from, and we can say, manager A, you can't buy this list. And so now you're walking me into a world that's not as easy for me to deal with because I don't have a list, right? So how would you advise us to make that jump from exclusion to inclusion, from not buying this to creating impact for the portfolio. So how do we make that change?
Right. So we do have that list as well.
You better have that list.
I'm sorry?
You better have that list.
So we're screening for things like tobacco, violent video gaming, abortion, pornography, alcohol, companies that pollute the environment. So we have a list of negative or exclusionary lists that our portfolio managers and our analysts have to abide by, and we hold them very accountable to that. So we have a compliance process that screens our holdings to make sure that we're not violating those lists. But beyond that, for all of our analysts, when they are investing in a company, they're held accountable to their investments. So we have weekly meetings with the analyst team, and they have to stand in front of the entire portfolio management team and give an account of why they invest in the companies they invest in. And so on a weekly basis, we probably have about 10 to 12 companies that come into our office, especially in the biotech space. And we are asking purpose-based questions to these companies. We're asking them, why do you exist? How are you adding value in this world? How are you adding value specifically to your customers and your employees, your supply chain, your host communities, your environment, and the broader society? So we force the CEOs, the sales directors in these companies to be thinking about value creation by asking them the questions as well. And of course, as I said, our analyst team has to give an account of that back to the management of the company.
But we have a portfolio, so we have lots of managers, and I visit with managers all the time. We're starting to see more and more growth to this impact type existence of management style. But how would you advise us? I realize what you do at Eventide, but how would you tell us to operate in that world, and how do we identify if there's really is, if that's going on, if they really are attempting to have impact, if they're not just doing negative screening, but actually trying to provide good investments for us? How do we do that?
Yeah, so there might be financial advisors here that are bringing clients to the Alabama Baptist Foundation. I think the biggest challenge for an advisor is navigating the conversations, right? Because you may have a Christian client, you may have a non-Christian client. You may have a Christian client who has thought about these principles before, somebody else who is very new in thinking about this. And there are so many questions. Recently somebody asked me, shouldn't we just focus on making all we can so that we could give all we can? And I said, well, John Wesley preached a sermon, and he said, make all you can to give all you can, but make all you can without hurting yourself or your neighbor in body or in soul. So if you look at the Bible, there's so many principles and teachings that come back to investing, which is not obvious when you first read it. Proverbs chapter 1 talks about ill-gotten gain. Leviticus chapter 19 talks about loving your neighbor, but it's talking to business people, how they should treat their hired servants and the poor in the community. And the passage goes on to say, love your neighbor as yourself. There's a story where King David is hiding in the cave of Adullam from the Philistines towards the end of his life, where he says, oh, I wish I had water from so-and-so well in Bethlehem. And the Bible says that his mighty men risked their lives, fetched the water, and they brought it back to David. And David pours the water in front of his men and says, I cannot drink the blood of my men, right? The Bible doesn't say there was actual blood in the water, but David sees that his men has taken on too much risk for his benefit. So we as investors, we have to be asking ourselves, what types of risks are the employees in these companies taking for our benefit? Are we exploiting others for our benefit, or are we creating value in the world and benefiting? Is the profit a byproduct of value creation and human flourishing, or is the profit a byproduct of exploitation? And also another verse that really convicted us early in 2008 was Romans chapter 12. Verses 1 and 2 says, I beseech you therefore, brethren, in view of God's mercies, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing unto God. For this is your spiritual act of worship. And then verse 2 goes on to say, and do not conform any longer to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, so that you can test and approve God's perfect will, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. So worship is not just something that we do on Sundays, but it's something we do every day of our lives. How we approach our work is an act of worship. How we approach investing is an act of worship. So someone asked me recently, how do you define biblically responsible investing? I would say the most basic definition of biblically responsible investing would be investing as an act of worship. And what that means is that there is sacrifice, right? So we're not investing in everything. But at the same time, it's also an act of not conforming to the world or to the patterns of this world, but approaching investing differently, thinking about it differently, and seeking to conform to the teachings of Christ and the principles of Christ, right? The way of Christ, and understanding that within the investment context.
Perfect. Thank you, Robin. Appreciate it very much. I'm going to take, thank you to Robin. Thank you.